Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style. Edited by Tait, Aronoff, Peter Dreyer, and Michael Kazin. Narrated by Kirsten Potter and Kyle Tait. Part 1. Is a New America Possible? Introduction. Tait Aronoff, Peter Dreyer, and Michael Kazin. America will never be a socialist country, President Donald Trump declared in his 2019 State of the Union address. The American left is on the cusp of a great victory, wrote an apprehensive David Brooks, the conservative New York Times columnist, in 2018. More than at any time since World War I, over 100 years ago, Americans are talking about socialism. Conservatives fear it. Liberals question it. Many progressives and radicals embrace it. Why is that word, and the egalitarian vision it defines, enjoying a resurgence in the United States? And does it mean, as Trump warned and Brooks predicted, that socialism is on the American horizon? In 2016, Senator Bernie Sanders, a Democratic socialist, captured the nation's attention and more than 13 million votes in his campaign for the Democratic nomination for president. 2 years later, voters elected Democratic socialists Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York and Rashida Tlaib of Detroit to Congress, while dozens of their counterparts won races for city council, state legislative, school board, and other seats around the country. According to a 2019 Gallup poll, 43% of all Americans and 58% of Americans between 18 and 34 years old believe that socialism would be a good thing for the country. Democratic socialists have played key roles in the upsurge of activism during the 21st century in social movements like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the fight for $15 minimum wage, Me Too, the anti-Trump resistance, and the battle for a Green New Deal. The Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, which long languished with just a few thousand members, has exploded. By mid-2019, the organization counted more than 60,000 people among its ranks, with more than 200 chapters in red and blue states alike. Iowa has the highest density of DSA members per capita. Almost all of those new members are millennials or younger still, without the Cold War-era hang-ups of their baby boomer and Gen X parents. Americans seem to be holding their breath, trying to decide what kind of country we want to be. An overwhelming majority of Americans are frustrated and fed up with the economic and political status quo. Ideas considered radical only a few years ago, universal health care, tuition-free college, a $15 federal minimum wage, same-sex marriage, requiring big corporations to put workers and union members on their boards, a Green New Deal, and many others enjoy popular support and have been embraced by some of the Democratic Party's biggest names. Is it possible that, within a generation, we might turn this troubled plutocracy into a socialist democracy? It's hardly radical to say that the United States could be run a lot better and more decently than it is now. There's much we can learn from other countries. We could cobble together the best parts of what other cities and countries have to offer to make the United States a much fairer and more caring place. Sweden's generous family leave policy, Vienna's luxurious public housing, which still accounts for about a third of the city's housing stock. Another third is cooperatively owned. Britain's comprehensive national health service, Spain's financial support for coal miners who will lose their jobs as the country shutters its last mines. But we don't just have to look abroad for successful ideas. We should also look to our own nation's history to find examples of progressive, even radical programs that raised standards of living, tamed the greed of big corporations, made our cities and rural areas more livable, and expanded rights to previously disenfranchised groups. During the 1930s, federal programs created not just magisterial infrastructure and conservation projects, but also murals, national parks, and avant-garde theater productions. Back in the 1950s, before decades of wage stagnation and outrageous corporate profits, the top marginal tax rate in the United States reached 91%, and young people graduating from college weren't burdened with 5, 6, and even 7-figure debt. More than a third of wage earners belonged to unions, compared to just over 10% today. This period, from the mid-1930s to the mid-1970s, which historians call the New Deal order, was far from a wonderland of equality and economic security. People of color and their white allies waged epic battles for survival, civil rights, and a measure of political power. Women and LGBTQ people had to fight for respect and the right to live and love as they pleased. Many were excluded from the redistributive policies that built the white middle class. In the name of anti-communism, the U.S. government tried to crush popular revolutions in the Third World and, under Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, waged a near genocidal war in Indochina. It's hardly an era worth returning to. But the gap between the rich and everyone else was far smaller than it is now, and liberal presidents, facing pressure from below, were confident enough in the powers of government and continued economic prosperity that they actually vowed to do away with poverty. A best-selling 1962 book about the poor by America's leading socialist Michael Harrington, The Other America, did much to inspire that ambition. Today, in what is still the richest nation that has ever existed, a few things should be as non-negotiable as they are elsewhere. Everyone should enjoy quality health care that stretches from cradle to grave, including preventative care, mental health services, and prescription drugs. No one should go hungry. Anyone who wants a job should have one. What zip code you live in shouldn't determine the quality of the education you receive. And the color of your skin shouldn't dictate how you're treated by banks, landlords, police officers, or district attorneys. The country you were born in shouldn't predict how many rights you have once you leave it. And no one should live in fear that their world, or that of their children or grandchildren, will be made unlivable by global warming. And that's just the bread, to crib a phrase coined by the labor organizer Rose Schneiderman a century ago. We can have our roses, too. Paid vacations, public parks and beaches to spend them on, and expansive public transit networks within cities and high-speed rail between them. For residents of today's actually existing social democracies, most of which are in Northern and Western Europe, these ideas might all seem run-of-the-mill. Their citizens live in what the UN has called some of the happiest countries in the world, with Finland taking the #1 slot. And while these models are not without their limitations, residents of these places enjoy all or most of the benefits one needs to live a dignified life. For many Americans, that probably sounds downright utopian, even, dare we say, socialist. Trump's warning about America's socialist future, echoed by Fox News and the Republican Party, was intended to rile up the conservative base. For sure, some Americans still identify socialism with totalitarian communism, or just with big government. But for most Americans, especially those under 40, socialism is no longer the authoritarian red menace it was for generations past, nor the province of an out-of-touch and isolated left-wing fringe peddling newspapers and ideology. Magazines like New York publish trend pieces about how young socialists spend their Friday nights. Elected officials are asked to explain democratic socialism on late-night talk shows. More consequentially, proposals that have long wallowed in left-wing backwaters, from Medicare for All to a federal job guarantee, are now decidedly mainstream. Many leading Democrats, including those eyeing the Oval Office, have adopted ideas once considered radical. Politicians who once fashioned themselves as business-friendly centrists have embraced policies long championed by socialists, past and present. Their reasoning is entirely pragmatic. These proposals are popular with large swaths of the voting public because most Americans realize they would go a long way toward meeting today's most pressing challenges, from climate breakdown to wealth inequality, at the scale those crises demand. Even former Clinton-era Treasury official Brad DeLong recently admitted that the approach he and his colleagues adopted in Washington, pursuing compromise with the GOP and economic growth above all else, has run its course. If they ever did, Republicans are no longer operating in good faith, and there is no political path to a coalition built from the center out. Instead, he suggests, we accommodate ourselves to those on our left. The world appears to be more like what lefties thought it was than what I thought it was for the last 10 or 15 years. The gap between what's needed and what establishment types consider pragmatic might be clearest when it comes to the climate crisis, as the world's leading scientists urge that rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society are needed to avert catastrophe. Elites in both parties have joined the fossil fuel industry in casting large-scale public investments to mitigate this existential threat as a pipe dream. As climate scientist Will Steffen observed, getting greenhouse gas emissions down as soon as possible has to be the primary target of policy and economics. You have got to get away from the so-called neoliberal economics. The main constraints on climate action, he added, aren't physical or chemical, but tied up in our value systems, politics, and legal systems. In the context of massive racial and economic inequality, rising temperatures will distribute their worst destruction to those already worst off. We still have time to prevent the most apocalyptic of climate scenarios from playing out, and it's been the young people flocking toward socialism who grasp that fact and the need for a clear alternative most firmly. Unlike environmentalists past, they don't see any trade-off between a decarbonized world and a more equal and prosperous one. As Naomi Klein writes in her chapter in this book, Democratic Socialism for a Climate-Changed Century, the Green New Deal, embraced by DSA and 81% of Americans as of February 2019, is a chance to build both. There is no alternative but to build an alternative, and more Americans think democratic socialism might be the best option. Still, what those who embrace the label mean by socialism is subject to much debate. On the right, everything from the Green New Deal to an increase in the minimum wage has been decried as a step towards Stalinism. But conservatives have been making such charges since the 1928 presidential campaign, when Herbert Hoover branded Al Smith, his Democratic opponent, a socialist for wanting to raise taxes on the rich and favoring an 8-hour workday. For some on the radical left, social democratic policies are merely compromises to preserve capitalism, preferring a society where all productive enterprises are held in common and administered by workers. If you're looking for an authoritative definition of democratic socialism, you won't find it in this anthology. What we do believe is this: any socialist society worth struggling for should be fiercely democratic, ensure that human rights will flourish, and hold free elections open to all kinds of candidates and parties, including those who oppose socialism itself. We hold no brief for the one-party dictatorships that still exist in North Korea, China, and Cuba, or for the failed states of the old USSR and its allies in Eastern Europe, which gave socialism a bad name. At the same time, there is plenty of daylight between democratic socialism and social democracy and left liberalism. The biggest fault lines break down around questions of who owns what, be that corporations, the public, or the workers directly, and how many of society's key institutions are democratically controlled. Do we simply take some services, like healthcare, out of private hands to be run in the public interest, or try to nationalize key sectors, like the fossil fuel industry, through a public buyout? What role does the government play in guiding economic activity, and what matters should be left to the market? Our contributors answer these questions differently. They run the gamut from social democrats to democratic socialists and points right and left, and define each in different terms. So do the three of us. But we also see diversity of outlooks as a strength in this messy, growing, and ever-evolving movement of people who have profound criticisms of the system in which we live. Uniquely, democratic socialists set their sights on moving beyond capitalism as society's operating system, not simply to make it more tolerable. They strive to build an economy and society that prioritizes the well-being of people and planet above all else, replacing capitalism's endless thirst for hoarded profits with a quest for widespread prosperity. The pressing question isn't how precisely to define democratic socialism, but what we need it to do when its alternatives have so clearly failed. Fleshing that out and building toward it will mean much more than just importing best practices from history or abroad, although we have much to learn from both. In Scandinavia's social democracies, healthcare is free and state-of-the-art. A far higher proportion of workers are in labor unions. In tiny Iceland, 92% of residents are unionized. As a result, wages are higher and more evenly distributed across professions and skill sets. That, combined with excellent public education, makes upward mobility a far more realistic prospect than it is in the United States. A proliferation of red-green parties have also made gender equality and mitigating climate change top priorities. The Nordic countries are consistently world leaders on both. Existing social democracies offer many lessons, but they are by no means a blueprint for building a sustainable and multiracial democracy in today's United States. Norway's generous social democracy has been furnished largely by oil wealth, and xenophobic politicians have gained clout across Europe on promises to defend their country's generous welfare states from mostly non-white foreigners. Amid rising anti-immigrant sentiment, Denmark, for instance, sorts predominantly Muslim new arrivals into official ghettos to be surveyed and assimilated. In hardening these laws, the country's social democrats have found common cause with its far right. Danes, the New York Times wrote in an extensive report on such policies, have become so desensitized to harsh rhetoric about immigrants that they no longer register the negative connotation of the word ghetto and its echoes of Nazi Germany's separation of Jews. Of course, racism and xenophobia are no lesser threats to prospects for an egalitarian America. We don't look like Denmark in terms of our social policies because we don't look like Denmark demographically, Ian Haney-Lopez and Heather McGee have observed. In our diverse society, racism has been the plutocrat's scythe, cutting down social solidarity to harvest obscene wealth and power. Right-wing politicians and their corporate patrons have ripped apart vital social programs and divided social movements on the false grounds that they only serve people of color, whom they paint as lazy and undeserving, and that a generous welfare state somehow deprives industrious whites their fair share of America's pie. Amid the labor militancy of the 1970s, when 1 in 6 union members went on strike, that strategy was corporate America's antidote to sever the bonds built on picket lines and to unraveling the New Deal order. It was a quick jump from right-wing lies about welfare queens defrauding the dole to the 90s destructive war on drugs and the mass incarceration it brought with it, a war battled by Republicans and Democrats both. White supremacy isn't just another issue for socialists to take seriously. It's a major barrier to building the world we need. Moving toward a more equal future, as several contributors contend, will require public policies that grapple squarely with our past and its burden on the present. There is nothing short of a world to lose. The chapters that follow propose ways to build a kinder, more humane, and altogether freer society, and suggest how to overcome the barriers to that future. We've asked a group of talented writers, academics, and organizers from across the American left to lay out their visions for this better world, how to get there, and what stands in the way. As has always been true in the history of the left, there are contradictions and disagreements, as well as plenty of common ground. This collection is meant, above all, to spark a conversation about what an American democratic socialism might look like, which, we think, is the best way of defining it. To ground the discussion, Peter Dreyer and Michael Kazin first trace the history of socialism in the United States through its successes and failures, and through the lives of some of its most important figures, well-known and otherwise. Andrea Flynn, Susan Holmberg, Dorian Warren, and Felicia Wong then lay out how deeply racism shapes American society and public policy, making the case for a third Reconstruction to address rampant racial and economic inequality that could begin to right historical wrongs. Diving in further, economist Derek Hamilton proposes what he calls a three-legged stool of policies to mend our unequal economy, comprised of a federal job guarantee, baby bonds, and reparations. Naomi Klein describes how the logic of extraction has defined socialist and capitalist governments, and how, learning from resistance to both, the Green New Deal can help repair the disastrous results in time to save the planet. Kicking off a section on expanding and freeing up democracy, Bill Fletcher Jr. offers some tough lessons for a new generation of socialists eager to take power, unpacking the many things that word can mean to the left. J. Mi-Jin Cha reviews how our electoral system, and the way we vote in particular, serves elite interests and keeps millions out of the democratic process, then offers common-sense reforms to correct the imbalance. Robert Kuttner explains how corporate power took over our government and how to wrest it back. David Dayen sears our bloated financial sector in his plan to remake the banking system and root out the greed that created the last recession and continues to leave Americans worse off. Sarita Gupta, Stephen Lerner, and Joseph A. McCartan consider the future of work and how a more militant labor movement could play a key role in making the American economy and our politics more democratic. Aviva Stahl calls for dismantling our destructive criminal justice system by challenging our understanding of safety and the role of police and prisons. In her chapter on immigration, Michelle Chen spells out the case for open borders and prioritizing human rights above citizenship. Tejasvi Nagaraja explores what a democratic socialist approach to foreign policy would entail, abroad and in our own backyard. Thomas J. Segru then maps out how corporate America, the real estate industry, and government policy fostered racial and economic segregation in our metropolitan areas and outlines a set of housing, transportation, and other policies to make cities and suburbs both more livable. Dorothy Roberts makes the case for universal health care and why Medicare for All alone won't go nearly far enough in correcting the many ways our medical system mistreats patients of color. Sarah Leonard reimagines the family freed from capitalism and the many forms it can take on when reproductive justice is front and center. Pedro Noguera charts a path to defining, improving, and expanding one of America's oldest public goods, education. From Little League to stadiums to players' unions, David Zirin envisions sports under democratic socialism. Spoiler, they're more fun. Francesca Fiorentini looks forward to a world where artists of all sorts are supported to do what they love and make societies more resilient in the process. Finally, Harold Meyerson points us toward the world we need, drawing lessons from the past about how to get from here to there. And we revive Michael Walzer's 1968 essay, A Day in the Life of a Socialist Citizen, which details how pleasantly mundane a radically egalitarian world could be. As these chapters underscore, the scale of work required to build the United States envisioned here is daunting, but not impossible. It will require going toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful industries the world has ever known, from finance to fossil fuels. And given the accelerating climate crisis, we're working against the clock. But socialists have never been keen to back down from a fight. Today's democratic socialists are bringing both big ideas back to American politics and a willingness to go to bat for them, from inside and outside the halls of power. Insurgent left politicians have been shaped and inspired by the social movement uprisings of the last decade. They know full well that transformative change in the United States, whether the abolition of slavery, universal suffrage, the 8-hour workday, or civil rights, has always been the result of pressure from below that forced office holders to change their policies, if not their minds. Those victories also required naming enemies, and, in the case of slavery, battling the defenders of an economic and political order that had been core to the growth of American capitalism. The opportunity waiting on the other side of these fights is tremendous. To salvage humanity's prospects for a livable future from the jaws of the 1%, to finally reckon with our nation's racist past and present, to wrest true democratic control over the institutions that shape our world, and to create a society of joy and contentment instead of anxiety and insecurity. As the socialist poet Langston Hughes once put it, "Oh, let America be America again. The land that never has been yet, and yet must be. The land where every man is free."
How Socialists Changed America. Peter Dreyer and Michael Kazin. Women's right to vote, Social Security, the minimum wage, workplace safety laws, universal health insurance, and civil rights for all races and genders were once considered radical ideas. Today, a vast majority of Americans consider these to be common-sense ideas, among the cornerstones of a decent society. They also favor government-run police departments, fire departments, national parks, municipally owned utilities, local subway systems, and public universities. They think that the super-rich should pay much higher taxes than the middle class. They believe that businesses should be subject to rules that require them to act responsibly. Banks shouldn't engage in reckless predatory lending. Energy corporations shouldn't endanger the planet and public health by emitting too much pollution. Companies should be required to guarantee that consumer products, like cars, food, and toys, are safe, and that companies pay decent wages and provide safe workplaces. How did these and other radical ideas move from the margins to the mainstream of our culture? Socialists played a major role in bringing about all these changes. In the parties they founded, the social movements they helped to form and lead, and the ideas they expressed. America has had a socialist movement since the late 1800s. For most of that time, socialists had a respected political party that ran candidates for office, popular newspapers and magazines, and well-known, even beloved public figures. But even when the party itself was marginal, there have always been individuals who espoused socialist ideas with vigor and eloquence. Helen Keller, W.E.B. Du Bois, Upton Sinclair, Charlie Chaplin, Albert Einstein, Walter Reuther, A. Philip Randolph, Gloria Steinem, Martin Luther King Jr., and Michael Moore were among the most famous Americans of the 20th century, although most of their fellow citizens did not know that they embraced socialism. Socialism has always been both an idea and a movement. As an idea, it is about advancing human progress by creating laws and institutions that give people the chance to reach their full potential and to tame the forces of greed, racism, inequality, and exploitation inherent in capitalism. As a movement, socialism is about promoting those ideas through education, grassroots activism, and elections. During the past half-century, activists and thinkers have embraced the phrase democratic socialism to emphasize the importance of such democratic ideals as free speech and voting rights, and in part to distinguish their movement from authoritarian communism. Has American socialism been successful? If success means that the United States has become a democratic socialist country, then the movement has certainly failed. But if success means that many Americans now accept ideas that were once considered radical, even socialist, and made the United States a more egalitarian and humane society, then it has accomplished a great deal. The left, and the socialist movement within it, has always included three kinds of people. Organizers built grassroots organizations that pushed for reforms such as women's equality, civil rights, workers' rights, environmental justice, and peace. Politicians used election campaigns to educate the public, and if they won, push for changes that translated radical ideas into legislation. Artists and thinkers, novelists, painters, poets, theologians, journalists, actors, playwrights, academics, and singers, use their talents to inspire people to dream, hope, and struggle for social justice, often under difficult circumstances. Origins. In the early 1800s, Europe began a new phase of human civilization. Historians call it the Industrial Revolution, or capitalism, but for most people, it was simply a momentous change in everyday life. People who once lived as farmers and peasants were pushed off their land and pulled into the burgeoning cities and towns, where they worked in factories, mines, and warehouses under brutal conditions and for long hours, lived in overcrowded and unhealthy slums, and suffered indignities that squeezed their humanity from them. In most countries, the owners of the factories and the slums used their political influence to ensure that the laws protected their property and profits, not workers' lives. Few workers had the right to vote, so they had no voice in establishing the rules and laws that
Sample complete. Ready to continue?